I was the former director of the Truth and Healing effort at a former Catholic Indian boarding school, Red Cloud Indian School in Pine Ridge, South Dakota. It was the first and so far only effort of its kind in the nation to be an Indigenous boarding school, former Indigenous boarding school in the Catholic Church that is of its kind in the whole United States. And my task was to help guide the community, guide the institution through a truth and reconciliation process. And it was no small feat. It was 4 years of work that I did, collecting numerous testimony from elders who had been in the boarding school themselves, the oldest ones we could possibly find, who were still with us. Some of them were in their 90s, to hear their stories of what it was like to be in the boarding school. And for those who aren't familiar, I do want to spend a little bit of time on that particular history, right? Just so that you're aware of it. The United States, in conjunction with numerous Christian churches, but primarily the Catholic Church, engaged in a process starting in the mid-1800s of systematically removing Indigenous children from their homes and sending them to these boarding schools that were peppered throughout the country. There were hundreds of such schools that were in place around this nation and in Canada, and thousands of Indigenous children were separated from their families under this effort to separate them from not only their language, but also their culture and their families. And the institutions themselves were rife with challenges and issues. They were underfunded, they had inadequate resources, and they had, of course, an incredible amount of physical, sexual, and cultural abuse that are already a part of sort of the boarding school experience. Initially, families were mandated to send their children to these schools under the threat of starvation. And since that many Native American communities at that point in time in history in the mid-1800s were 100% reliant on the federal government for any kind of sustenance, having been corralled onto reservations and unable to live the ways that they previously did. But as with many systems of oppression, what began as forced compliance gradually morphed into generational normalization. And even after the mandates ended, deep poverty at home made these institutions appear pragmatic to families. And so generations of Indigenous people came through these schools. The Catholic Church, through numerous orders, ran roughly half of those schools in Canada and over 100 of those schools here in the United States. So my school that I went to, Red Cloud Indian School, formerly Holy Rosary Mission, was one such school. My grandparents went there. My great-grandparents attended it when it was still a boarding school. My father went there as well. That's him on the right, with his two little brothers at the school. My aunt, who also went to school there, became a sister of the Order of St. Francis and remained a sister for the rest of her life. And my father also was a seminarian and a Catholic monk before he ultimately met my mother. And he was Catholic also for the rest of his life. So this history is deeply personal to me, having had my own family go through this experience of being in the boarding schools. On my mother's side, we were deeply traditional in our Lakota ceremonies and customs. My mother is the one who's actually the descendant of Nicholas Black Elk, servant of God, and she ultimately did not choose to pursue the Catholic faith in her own life. She came to see herself as a keeper of our traditions and ceremonies. So I grew up both Catholic and Lakota, practicing both. And I never knew growing up that those two things were seen by a lot of people as innately contradictory, because that was just who I was and what I did. Two spiritualities and two sacred ways of knowing the world. I felt really blessed to have those two different lenses to view God and the world. I tell that story, or I talk about this story just because I think it's important to recognize I didn't really know about this conflict until much later in life. Much later in life. I was roughly maybe 9 or 10 years old when I first got a hint that these were not compatible, supposedly. I was with my mother one day, and I remembered suddenly, oh, Mom never goes to church on Sunday with Dad and I. How come? And I think in my childhood mind, it was because she was at home making breakfast. And so then we got back from church, that was there. But it just occurred to me later on that, she never came with us. So I asked her one day, finally, how come you never come to church with Dad and I? And she said, well, I don't believe in that. And I actually think it's incompatible with being Lakota. And I was sort of thrown aback because I'm Lakota, aren't I? And I'm also Catholic. And so I said, what do you mean? And she said, let me put it this way. All you need to do to know about how a people view the world is to look at their creation story. And she said, so look at our 2 creation stories. What's the creation story for the Catholics? And I said, Adam and Eve. And she said, yes, and what's the creation story for Lakota? And I gave a brief rundown of our view of the earth as our mother and of us being her children. And she said, okay, here's what those 2 stories say. In the Catholic world, right, earth is not a place that God gifted us, it's a place of banishment. In the Catholic world, we are, women are meant to suffer and serve their husbands, not be co-partners and be, caretakers of this earth. And so that, among many other ways, are just reasons why we are not compatible. And I just kind of went, what am I supposed to do with this information? I'm only like 10. I went to my dad later on and I said, Dad, this is what Mom said. Like, what do I do with that? And he gave me this very sort of like knowing sigh. And he said, your mom's not wrong, but she's talking about culture. And culture changes, but God is what is eternal. And as humans grow and learn, we hopefully try to get closer and closer to God's truth. And that's how I understand what it means to be Lakota and Catholic. And I'll always take that lesson with me for the rest of my life. That yes, culture, humans can get wrong, but God is eternal. So now that I've offered you a bit of that context as to where I'm from and the work I've been doing, what I would like to spend a bulk of time talking about tonight is the lessons I sort of took away from the 4 years I worked in the truth and healing effort between my own community of Indigenous Oglala Lakota people and the Catholic Church, and all the people who sort of exist in between and outside of those spaces that have sort of touched that work. And the first lesson I want to talk about is the idea of reconciliation as revenge, which I think is something that is one of the perils of this work. And that might seem a bit dramatic, and that's because it is. There's a point there to it that I want to talk about. Sometimes reconciliation, the process of it, isn't really used for reconciliation. Really, it's used as a space for revenge, right? We live in a time of, right, the sort of cancel culture and the public call-out culture where the power of voice can quickly become a weapon used to, I think, actually reify some of the really terrible power dynamics that exist in our society. And I think, in my experience at Red Cloud, a reconciliation was used in this way, sort of as a cudgel against the institution and against the Catholic Church. And this primarily came from some young activists who are going to become a little bit of the characters in my debate or in my discussion right now. And I'll admit I'll probably sound a little bit bitter during this section, but I'm not. But I have to rename some of the things that happened in order to really give you the context of why this is a lesson I learned. There were some young activists who called themselves the International Indigenous Youth Council, Youth Treaty Council, who were Indigenous themselves from my own community, right, from the same places and spaces as I was, who became kind of my, for lack of a better word, nemesis during this truth and reconciliation effort. I tried to work really hard with them to be their allies, but they were pretty determined to be my enemy instead. And they did a lot of things. They successfully pressured our tribal council to use their government action and suspend all church operations on the reservation. Before that was then immediately rescinded because of the sort of overwhelming community outcry for that reason. People forgot when you suspend all the churches across the reservation that you suspend a lot of really wonderful, meaningful missionary activity and service to our poorest and most marginalized. And that became a sudden realization when there were no more lunches for the homeless, no more schools for Sunday schools, no more sort of after school activities and that kind of thing. They created striking visuals that would be easily spread across social media, shocking graphics, including one that claimed that 90% of students were sexually abused before 1990, which was rooted in nothing truthful, no certain studies, but it wasn't the point, right? That wasn't the point of why they shared those kinds of things. They weren't based in evidence, but they were powerful, and they were shareable, and they were easily made viral. And that played well in the media. In one highly publicized talk, our school was compared to a concentration camp. Not historically, but today, right? Our school today as it was. They claimed that we indoctrinate, that we brainwash, and they suggested that any Indigenous Catholic person is by definition brainwashed, a race traitor, no longer truly Indigenous, because to be Indigenous is to not be Catholic. Those two things aren't allowed to be the same. So I don't want to spend too much time on that group, but I do want to share a very brief clip from a nationally syndicated podcast that they, in their media savviness, got produced. And I'm going to play this clip because I think it indicates something that's really powerful and interesting and I think core to this particular project. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a moment and share my audio instead so that we can hear that.
Eleanor and the rest of the IIYC presented a list of demands to the Jesuits, and they did it with force. They confronted them on the front lawns of the school and gave them a list which basically told the Catholic Church to get the hell out of here.
Land back, land back.
Land back, a movement to return Indigenous land back to Indigenous peoples. Eleanor got into Sheena's face. We weren't there, so we can't speak to it, but it's clearly still in the air.
You know, my family, they're still really against what I do. My mom doesn't like the Lakota way of life. She thinks it's demonic in a way because my grandpa taught her that. That's when it clicked for me. Whenever I found out, you know, my grandfather was abused at Holy Rosary Mission and, you know, for trying to speak his language, for trying to practice his way of life, you know, he couldn't be Lakota. He had to be a white man. So I still don't have her support in what I do.
What I hope that clip shows is just a couple of things that I think are really important. What strikes me is certainly Eleanor, the young woman who spoke after the journalist spoke, the depth of her pain is really present, especially if you were to listen to the whole thing, but also the entrenchment of that binary, of the us versus them, the binary of colonized and colonizer, and of Indigenous and non-Indigenous, the Catholic and Indigenous, is, I think, one of the more insidious effects of colonization. The way that Eleanor speaks about her mother hating the Lakota way of life and that her grandfather chose to be a white man instead is one of the more insidious, I think, elements of colonization that still persists in this country and in this conversation to this day. Because unlike a lot of places that have experienced post-colonialism, that's not true here. We're still in the midst of colonialism. That hasn't changed. And so what you have instead is this real fear of letting go, of integration, and this fracture, this internal fracture of what it means to even be Indigenous, that to be Indigenous is to be colonized, and that therefore, in order to find something close to a pure identity, you have to sort of wrench the claws of anything European off of you. And that's a really fractured place to be. And I find that that conversation to have been one of the more challenging things to face in this effort of reconciliation that we went through between my people and the Catholic Church. Anything less than resistance to that is a betrayal, right? A betrayal of your Indigenous identity. It's not only wrong, but it's dangerous to think that way. It creates people in this way as a monolith, right? And we know that people are not monoliths. And we also know that healing does not come through that kind of hate and anger. But that's really difficult to talk about. So yes, reconciliation can be used like a weapon, right? It can reinforce that kind of division when done this way, but it doesn't have to, right? Here are just different social media images that kind of went viral during that whole time. One of which, again, described the suspension of church activity across the reservation. The other one just kind of an overall call to ban and remove all churches from the reservation. Knowing then, of course, that these churches serve Lakota people and that Lakota people are in the pews. And so even though the narrative that existed in these activist minds was Indigenous versus a white Catholic church, the impact was on an Indigenous church. And there was a real failure to kind of see that and know that and understand that. So that's my first lesson, that sometimes reconciliation can be used as revenge. And we need to know that and understand that and see it when it happens and know that that's not really what we should be doing, that healing can't come through that kind of thing. The second lesson that I want to talk about, this is the podcast, by the way, that I briefly showed. The second takeaway that I want to talk about is what it means to heal the oppressor. That's actually a very taboo topic in the issue of reconciliation. Whether we're talking about individual reconciliation on that individual level between two people where one has harmed the other, when we talk about what does it mean to heal the author of the violence, that is something we don't like to talk about because in many ways the victim is sort of seen as the most important person and the most important part of the reconciliation process, and that's understandable. But what it means to heal the oppressor is a deeper question that I think we also need to ask ourselves. The oppressor, the institution, the author of the harm is also in need of healing. And in fact, by the very act of engaging in the harm, that person or that institution or that body has in some ways also harmed their soul. And we have to talk about what it means to heal that. Most in this situation wanted the church to simply sit, be silent, and wait for forgiveness, or, and I'll talk about this more later, focus on material acts of contrition. But this is neither theologically sound nor practically helpful. In fact, I found this to be one of the most urgent questions in our process. How does a church that claims universal truth, that calls itself Catholic, meaning universal, reconcile its participation in cultural genocide? What does it mean to be forgiven, to forgive oneself, to repair? I think these are profound Christian questions. What does mission look like in a post-genocidal, post-colonial context, or colonial context, current colonial context? The church must learn from its sins, not simply confess them, and become a church rooted in humility, radically altered by its mistakes. That's the true gospel work of reconciliation, not merely to admit, but to be transformed. Unfortunately, much of the focus from both inside and outside the church was on material restitution. And we see this a lot even in the church's obviously very complex history with the sexual abuse crisis, right? We see this in the indigenous context with land back, with the idea of money being the thing that needs to be returned, the removal of churches from the land. And while those conversations do matter, I don't want to say that they don't, they do not in and of themselves provide healing. We can speak to any number of sexual abuse survivors who've received, monetary restitution and find that that alone didn't provide them healing. Healing is not a transaction. Healing is not a press release. Healing is sacred work. The second thing I want to talk about is the hard work of healing the victim, the oppressed, on that binary. I don't even like to use these words, but I have to for the sake of figuring out, where we are, because that too is difficult to talk about and just as hard. One of the things that we hear all the time in the sort of critiques of reconciliation is, why can't people just move on? Why can't we just get over it? And while this is often said dismissively, there is a sliver of something to sit with. Because real healing is kind of moving on. Not forgetting, not denying, but overcoming. We've discovered in our work 3 main barriers to healing. The first is that people sometimes just don't want to heal. They're not ready for it. Many aren't ready. They still need the anger. They still need something that feels like retribution. They need their pain to be witnessed before they can even imagine letting go. That's a hard place to be. It's actually more harmful to the person themselves than to anyone else in the process. And it's only overcomable from within. The second barrier is not believing that healing is possible. Some harms feel too vast. How do you heal from stolen language, from severed traditions, from lost ancestors? It feels impossible. But our faith tells us that nothing is impossible with God. The last barrier to healing is that we believe that we are not worthy of healing. This is especially a painful truth for victims of sexual abuse. Many feel complicit, unclean. Shame keeps them from even stepping toward healing, and shame is a prison. We don't like to talk about the difficult work of healing either. We prefer grand gestures, apologies, settlements. But what about the daily personal work of believing that you are worthy of love? What about the long road of returning to yourself, of forgiving others and forgiving you? That's reconciliation. That's the work. So my last lesson is hope in relationship. Despite it all, I believe in the power and praxis of relationship. I believe I've seen it in the reconciliation work I did. One of the most powerful moments of many came during a really tense meeting with the activist group I mentioned previously. They had issued demands, including to shut down the school. Tensions were high. And then an elder among them spoke. He said, "For decades, I've watched the government make promises and break them. But over time, we kept pushing, and some of those promises eventually were kept. Sometimes it just takes trust." He turned to us, the representatives of the church before him, and said, "Today I see you here trying to work with us. Maybe we just have to trust. And if you fail, we'll come back again." That moment, that leap of faith, is what reconciliation looks like. Not certainty, not purity, not erasure of pain, but a willingness to try again. And that ultimately is my final lesson. Ideas are important, but people are more important. Relationships are the heart of reconciliation. The priests and the sisters and the lay people who have done the most good were the ones who built deep relationships in our community. They didn't offer theological treatises and walk away. They didn't offer PR strategies. They showed up, they stayed, and they became family. If this church wants to overcome its history, it must be a church of relationship. That is its only true power, and what a profound power that is. As Pope Leo XIV said in his first address, paying attention, right? We must be a church in dialogue with love, a church on the margins, a church with the suffering. Over and over, our church has failed. And over, our church has tried to do better. We are human, and we hold both of those truths in beautiful, sacred tension. We cannot force healing. We cannot manufacture reconciliation. We can only lead others to the waters of healing and hope that they choose to drink. We can be like Christ, knocking at the door, waiting, not demanding, showing up in all our fullness when that door opens. That is the task, that is the hope, and that's the church that I still believe in. Thank you.